So whether or not you're red team or blue team, it really doesn't matter when you're a 3D artist, you just want the right CPU for the job. And since today Intel is releasing the new 10th gen CPUs and sent over a few for review on the channel, I thought it might be a perfect time to create this video guide for you guys, kind of determining what is going to be the best CPU for your use inside of Blender. We're going to be comparing the new world's fastest gaming processor, the 10900K that boosts all the way up to 5.3 gigahertz on a single core, to the world's technically possibly best workstation CPU, the one I personally use right now in the Threadripper setup back there you see, the 3970X with 32 cores. So we're going to be seeing in what use cases you want more cores and in what use cases you want the fastest cores. So most people, when they benchmark Blender, just use a few cycles benchmarks and compare render times, but that is not exactly benchmarking Blender. We're going to be doing some real world benchmarks today and actually benchmarking every single task inside of the 3D pipeline. So instead of just benchmarking in cycles, this video is more about benchmarking the overall experience inside of Blender. And I'm talking like physics benchmarks, smoke and fluid simulations inside of the new MantaFlow, Eevee Playback, animation, sculpting, things like this that you don't really think about. But say you're actually a character rigger or animator, or you work in sculpting a lot, one of these CPUs is likely going to be better than the other, and it might surprise you which one it is. So before you go out and just buy like a $2,000 Threadripper CPU, it's good to see where that CPU is going to be good for you and where a cheaper CPU actually might be faster for you. If you're looking for more of a technical video with the specifications and maybe some gaming benchmarks, this isn't going to be for you. You can go check out Linus's video or Steve's, the other Steve, Gamer Nexus Steve. So as you maybe have gotten the gist, we're not exactly comparing apples to apples in this video. Instead, we're going to determine what CPU is right for you depending on what you do inside of Blender. So for the CPUs we're comparing in this benchmark, it is the new i9 10900K from Intel, 10 core, 20 thread processor with boost speeds up to 5.3 gigahertz. And we'll also be benchmarking its little brother, the i5 10600K. It's a 6 core, 12 thread processor, will cost about half of what the i9 costs and would be a nice alternative for something a little bit cheaper. And I'll also be comparing some of these benchmarks to the previous generation 9900K to see how big of an upgrade it is from that generation. And of course, we're also then benchmarking the workstation like I mentioned behind me. So for the hardware that I'm running in this test bench, I am using the new ASRock Z490 Tashi motherboard. They sent this over for the video, and I've always just been a fan of ASRock motherboards. I've used them in almost all of my builds, and I've actually yet to have one of them fail on me, which is technically the most important part of a good motherboard. Plus, they look really cool, and they have all of the features that you need in the latest gen motherboards, paired with 32 gigabytes of 3200 megahertz RAM and the Titan RTX for the GPU. The CPU is then cooled with a 360 all-in-one cooler from Cooler Master, and I'm using a 500 gigabyte NVMe SSD drive. Also, I am running the latest version of Blender that I could get my hands on, the Blender 2.83 beta, just because there's all kinds of updates always being rolled out for Blender and improvements to things like the Viewport Performance. And without further ado, let's start off with some Viewport Playback benchmarks comparing these CPUs. So for starters, I made a benchmark of an animated character that's rigged and playing back in the viewport inside of Blender. And the FPS that we got on the 10900K was 29 FPS playback speed. It seems Blender's viewport handles fewer cores, maybe a little bit better than multi-cores, and this seemed to be proved true when the Threadripper 3970X playback speed was only 24 FPS in the viewport. So in this case, a gaming CPU, fewer cores, faster processor definitely takes the cake and is the superior CPU for viewport performance. Next, it was on to sculpting. So the benchmarks that I have for this is a super high resolution version of the monkey head in Blender. It's subdivided many times, and then I'm deforming the mesh in the viewport with a shape key to see what sort of FPS you get when making these sort of sculpting adjustments to a mesh this high res. The 10900K wins here with a 3 FPS playback speed inside of Blender. Yes, Blender could definitely be optimized to handle high resolution viewport playback better. This is still not very great at even 3 FPS, but it was the best out of these CPUs, as the Threadripper CPU was only 2.4 FPS on playback. So if sculpting is actually the main thing you do inside of Blender, you'll actually get the best performance using a gaming CPU over a workstation CPU. So the next benchmark is a really interesting one. This is an Eevee Playback scene. I'm using the tree creature from Daniel. It's uploaded on the Blender site. The 10900K plays this back at about 4.4 FPS inside of Eevee being rendered in real time, while the Threadripper CPU sat around 3.5 FPS. So this made the 10900K about 26% faster in Eevee Playback render than the Threadripper CPU. Since Eevee is more of a game engine built inside of Blender, that's likely why the gaming CPUs are performing better than the Threadripper CPU in this case. As you can see, the i5 also outperforms the Threadripper CPU with a better viewport performance speed of 3.9 FPS, and the 9900K sat between the two new Intel CPUs at about 4.1 FPS. And I think it's pretty obvious that a fast gaming CPU like the new 10900K is going to handle viewport performance better in Blender than in workstation CPU. But now we're on to some simulation and physics benchmarks. So I've made some new benchmarks for MantaFlow, which is the new fluid and smoke simulator inside of Blender. The first benchmark here is a fluid benchmark based off of the scene that I did a tutorial on a few months ago, and we're benchmarking just how long the simulation takes to calculate on all these CPUs. So here's the results for that. This is time in seconds, and the shorter results are better. So here we found some interesting results. The Threadripper CPU was about 4% faster than our 10-core 10900K Intel CPU, but taking a look at the task manager, I could see that Blender only utilized about 40% of the CPU power on the Threadripper CPU, and was definitely not utilizing all 32 cores to their full potential. Whereas on the 10900K, it did peak at 100% utilization at a few times, so it is using all of the cores and maybe would benefit from just a few more cores, as it was still slightly faster on the Threadripper CPU. So something like the 3900X actually might be the sweet spot with 16 cores for the best CPU in MantaFlow right now. And then for the smoke benchmark, I used a really cool explosion blend file from a fellow Blender YouTuber. I'll link to him in the description below. But this is just a really cool explosion simulation inside of MantaFlow using Blender 2.83, and benchmarking this on all of the CPUs. You can see that the Threadripper CPU was again about 6% faster than the 10900K. So I would say that 32 cores is a bit overkill, but something like the 10900K could probably benefit from just a few more cores to be the fastest CPU processor for calculating fluid and smoke simulations. And the last one was the physics simulation. So in this scene, I'm dropping approximately 400 monkey heads on top of each other and calculating the physics of these all colliding and interacting with each other. And this is where the gaming processor took the lead again and was the faster processor. Calculating physics inside of Blender is faster with fewer cores, but faster cores. So the 10900K won here, taking about 65 seconds to calculate this benchmark and coming in 18% faster than the Threadripper CPU. As you can see, the 10600K was also close behind it here and also faster than the Threadripper CPU. So the higher clock speeds is what is causing the gaming CPUs to be the lead here again when calculating physics inside of Blender. Okay, so that's it for the playback and the simulations and physics. Now it's time to see the rendering benchmarks. And as you guys know, it's not really fair to compare a 32-core processor to a 10-core gaming processor. But it wouldn't be a complete Blender RealWorld Benchmarks without doing just a few render benchmarks. So rendering the Cycles Classroom benchmark with the 10900K, it took roughly 6.5 minutes to complete. And this is actually about 30% faster than the previous generation 9900K. This is due to the faster clock speeds. It sustained about 4.9 gigahertz the entire time while rendering on all cores, which is really impressive. That paired with the 10 cores is why this new processor is about 30% faster than the previous 9900K. But of course, Cycles Benchmarks loves more cores, and that's why the 3970X takes the cake by a long shot here, coming in about 2.5 minutes to render a scene like this. I also ran the Victor Blender Cycles benchmark, and this one took about 14.5 minutes, whereas it took just over 6 minutes on the Threadripper CPU. So then to kind of help you decide which CPU is right for you inside of Blender, I split these benchmarks up into 3 different categories. We have our physics and simulations, we have our viewport and playback, and then we have our cycles rendering. So starting off with the viewport and playback speeds, the overall performance increase using a gaming CPU like the new 10900K compared to the Threadripper CPU behind me was 22% faster. So you get 22% more viewport speeds using a gaming CPU versus a workstation CPU. Then it was on to the physics and simulations, comparing what the average speed between all 3 benchmarks were, and Intel's new 10900K actually won by about 3% here over the Threadripper CPU behind me, and that's due to it being very similar in mana flow benchmarks, but the physics benchmarks being actually even faster on the Intel CPU. But then comparing the cycles benchmarks times, obviously the Threadripper CPU is going to run away with the lead here. The average speed increase with the Threadripper CPU was 155%, so roughly 2.5 times faster, which obviously makes sense because it's got 32 cores compared to just 10 cores. So hopefully this video helps you choose your next CPU. Depending on what you find yourself doing most often in Blender, you can now hopefully choose the right CPU for you. As a 3D artist, time is often money, so you want to find whatever hardware is going to speed up your workflow and what you do most in Blender. Also, if you want to purchase any of the CPUs in the video, I'm putting Amazon links in the description below. These are affiliate links, so they will help support the channel if you use those. And let me know if you guys like this type of video or would want another video on my personal workstation setup behind me there. I can do another video on that if you would like it, so let me know with the like on the video, and I'll see you guys all in a future video. Bye bye.